My name's Jamie, and I'm an IELTS trainer and English teacher from Edinburgh in the UK. So, today's session, we will be looking at the IELTS writing task 1, describing a dynamic chart. And we will look in a bit more detail at what you need to do for task 1. We will look at writing an introduction and overview, and some useful language for describing trends in detail. And we'll also have some time at the end for any questions you might have. So, moving on, let's have a look at the aims of today's webinar. By the end of the webinar, you will be able to look at a dynamic chart and identify and select the key features. This is a key criteria for writing task 1, being able to select the most important features of a graph to describe. We'll also look at using an appropriate structure for your task. To make sure that your writing is clear and easy for the examiner to follow. We'll look at how to write a good introduction and an overview. And we'll also look at a range of useful language to describe trends in more detail. So before we look at the task in a lot of detail, let's look at some common myths and misconceptions about task 1. What does it actually involve? So I'm going to show you some statements, and I'd like you to write in the comments whether you think these statements are true or false. If you think they're false, could you try to provide the correct answer? Okay, so let's take a look at the first one. In task 1, you need to write a description of a set of data. True or false?
Okay, we're waiting for answer.
Yeah, thank you, Rania. That's true.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nikunj. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Let's have a look at the second one. Number 2. This data could be in the form of a graph, a chart diagram, or process. For number 2, is this true or false? Very good. We're seeing lots of true responses there. Excellent. Number 3. You should write a minimum of 200 words for task 1. A minimum of 200 words. Okay. Thank you, Rania. You're saying it's false. Thank you, Nikunj. Very good. And Jehan as well. Number 4. You should spend around 30 minutes on writing task 1. True or false? Okay. Excellent. If you think it's false, can you try to provide the correct answer? Number 5. You should try to interpret the data you're given. You should try to interpret the data, for example, by drawing conclusions or making recommendations based on the data in the table or the chart. Okay. Most of you think that one is false as well. So let's take a look at number 6. You should give a personal opinion when writing task 1. Okay. So most of you think no personal opinion there. Number 7. You should summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and making comparisons where relevant. Okay, thank you, Jehan. Thank you, Paramjit. And the final statement, number 8, you should write a conclusion. Should you write a conclusion for the IELTS task 1? This one a bit more controversial. Some of you are saying false, Jihan and Rania. Some of you saying true. Let's take a look at the answers. Okay, so for number one, in task one, you need to write a description data. This is true, absolutely. That is the point of this task. You need to describe a set of data. For number two, this data could be in the form of a chart, graph, diagram, or process. Then this is absolutely true. Yes, it could also be in the form of a map as well. But the most common types of question are the chart and the graph or a diagram. For number three, you should write a minimum of 200 words. This was false, as you identified. It should be 150 words minimum. You won't be penalized if you write more than 150 words, but bear in mind that task 2 is worth twice as many marks as task 1. So you should focus most of your time and most of your word count on answering task 2 rather than task 1, which brings us to statement number 4. You should spend around 30 minutes on this task. Many of you said only 20 minutes. So this statement is false. The recommended time is about 20 minutes for task 1 and 40 minutes for task 2. If you can finish task 1 a bit faster in 18 minutes or so and give yourself a bit of extra time for task 2, that's great. Okay, so try, if you're confident enough to finish task 1, it's best to focus your time on task 2. For number 5, you should try to interpret the data given. This is also false. You only need to describe the data. You're not trying to explain it or draw conclusions from the data. You're simply describing what you see. And that leads us to number 6. There is no need to give a personal opinion. In writing task 2, you are likely to be asked to give a personal opinion on the topic, but for writing task 1, you're just describing the information given. For number 7, and this is very much true, you need to summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and making comparisons where relevant. You don't have time to describe every bit of information in the chart or table, so you need to select the key information and report it. Finally, you should write a conclusion, and I notice, Nikunj, you've mentioned that if you write an overview, then you don't need a conclusion. And I think that is a very good rule of thumb. A conclusion is not necessary. You will give the main information in your overview. If you find that you're running out of words, or rather you don't have enough words, but you've described the graph, you could write a short concluding sentence. Some of the question types, such as describing a process, you might benefit from writing a short concluding sentence. That's something we can look at in another webinar, but when you're describing a graph or a chart, you do not need to write a conclusion. You will not be penalized if you do write a conclusion, but it's not necessary. Okay, so I hope that has helped you to get an overview of task 1. Let's look now at an example structure for writing task 1. We need to write, first of all, an introduction. What does this consist of? Typically, the introduction will state what the chart or table is by paraphrasing the title or paraphrasing the question that you've been given. And this should not be very long. This is just 1 or 2 sentences explaining what the chart shows. Secondly, we can write an overview. And as we mentioned, this is where you state the main points, the main trends and events. And you would just choose 2 or 3 key pieces of information to mention here. You don't need to go into too much detail. You'll just simply describe the main movement, the highs and lows. You don't need to give figures or necessarily dates at this point. That will come next in the description part. Because it's not a very detailed description in the overview, you only need to write between 1 and 3 sentences for this part. The more detail will come in the description. This is where you expand on the main points you mentioned in your overview, giving the specific data and examples. And in this section, you can provide specific dates. Okay, so this is a typical structure. We're going to look at each of these sections in more detail now. Let's take a look at an example sentence, an example graph. The graph below shows the proportion of 4 different materials that were recycled from 1982 to 2010 in a particular country. So our first step when we're tackling this question is to think about what type of graph is this. So can anyone suggest the type of graph? Feel free to put it in the comments. Thank you, Rania. A line graph it is. Exactly, a type of line graph. And line graphs are typically what type of chart? Do they show a change over time, or do they take a snapshot of information at a specific point in time? Exactly, Jihan. They show a change time. We call this type of chart a dynamic chart when you're looking at changes. So this is the first thing to focus on when you look at your graph or your chart. Is it showing me over a period of time, or is it showing me a snapshot of data at a specific point in time? That will affect the type of language that you use to describe the chart. We need to think about what is being measured in this chart. What is the axis showing us? We have the years, and what else is being measured? Jihad, you mentioned recyclable materials, so this is correct. Is it, and the recycling rate of materials, excellent. And how is this being measured? Is it the numbers on the x-axis, are they talking about kilograms, tons, millions of tons? Thank you, Nikunj. It's a percentage, a proportion. So this is very important to establish the units being used and what we're talking about. So here we're talking about percentages. Right. What is the time period covered by the graph? It's between 2 dates. Excellent, Rania, from 1982 to 2010. So once we've clarified the time, this will help us to identify the tenses that we can use to describe to describe the changes. Are we going to use, are we talking about the future, the present, the past? What kind? It's the past, exactly. So the entire period being described is in the past. So we'll primarily be using the past simple. If the period includes the present, it goes from the past to present, then we might need to start using tenses such as the present perfect. But for here, we're describing a finished period in the past, completed action. So we use the past simple and past continuous for the most part. So we've looked at the data. We've got an idea of the language we're going to use. Our next step is to write an introduction. And how does this work? First, we need to paraphrase the title of the chart. We can do this by using synonyms and grammar transformation. We need to be accurate and precise to make sure we're describing exactly the information and the data that's given. But we don't want to write a very long list. Some of the charts and tables have a lot of data. They cover a lot of different information. You don't want to simply list all of the different categories that might be covered. I would suggest writing a list of no more than 5. Up to 5 is probably okay, but beyond that, you'll need to summarize or categorize further. So let's attempt to paraphrase this chart's title. The graph below shows the proportion of 4 different materials that recycle from 1982 to 2010 in a particular. Would you like in the comments to try to paraphrase the title of this chart in your own words? You can say the chart below, the graph below, what? I'll give you a minute or so to work on this. It's not an easy task, so take your time. Thank you, Jehan. The graph below indicates the cycling trend of 4 materials during 1982 to 2000. Very good. Okay, excellent. This is a very good attempt at paraphrasing, John. So I like the fact you've used a different word. The graph below indicates the recycling trend of 4 materials during 1982 to 2010. My only issue here would be this word, during. I wouldn't necessarily use during. I would use a different time marker, such as between or from. Okay, during will be a fixed. So you could say during 1982, but because you're describing from 1982 to 2010, you must use a word like between. Okay, excellent. Rania, I'm going to bring up your one here. So the graph illustrates the percentage of 4 different materials which were recycled in the period of 1980 to 2010 in a certain country. Very good. So here you again used a different word, illustrates, which is very nice. And instead of using proportion, you've said percentage, which is great. That's absolutely accurate. The graph illustrates the percentage of 4 different materials which were recycled in the period of 1982 to 2010 in a certain country. And that is fine. This is a very clear paraphrase. So well done, guys. I'll share with you I prepared earlier. Here is the first one. The chart illustrates the percentages of paper and cardboard, glass, aluminium cans, and plastic which were recycled in one country between 1982 and 2010. So here I've given a bit more specific by specifying the materials that are recycled, and I've used percentages instead of proportion. Instead of saying in a particular country, I've said in one country. And instead of from, I've said between. Okay? You do not need to, and you should not, try to change every word. You don't need to paraphrase each word. But as long as you show that you have a bit of flexibility and that you're not just copying the original title, that will be absolutely fine. A second example, the graph shows the recycling rates of 4 materials, paper and cardboard, glass, aluminium cans, and plastic in a given country over the period between 1982 and 2010. So here, instead of saying percentage or proportion, I've used the word recycling rates. And I've put the specific materials in brackets as a short list. And this is okay because there are too many. Instead of a particular country, a given country over the period between. Okay, so this is just another example. Many of your examples I can see in the comments are absolutely fine as well. So well done. Let's move on now. We have written an introduction. The next step is to write an overview. Now I'm showing the band here for task 1 to emphasize the importance of writing an overview. You can see that for a band 5, there's no clear overview. You're just describing the data, but without a clear summary of the key points. That will only allow you to get a band 5. Whereas if you present an overview with appropriate information, then that's an easy band 6. And then for band 7, if your overview is clear and clearly outlines the main trends, then that will enable you to get a band 7 minimum. So it's an important part of the task 1. You must write an overview, and that's why I suggest writing it directly after your introduction. So what can we include in the overview? We have our chart here. We want to identify the main trends, the patterns and events, and then select 2 or 3 main points to describe. This can take us 1 to 3 sentences directly after the introduction, but we don't want to include too much detailed information at this stage. That will come in the description section. So thinking about what are the main trends, the main points here in a dynamic graph or a dynamic chart, we need to think, what does the data do? What are the key features? Does it go up or down? Does it fluctuate or does it remain steady? Are there peaks or lows? And overall, does it increase or decrease? So I would like you in the comments to try and pick out, if you had to choose 2 or 3 key features of this chart, what would you describe in your overview? If you can put your suggestion in the comments, please. Okay, you've mentioned the aluminium cans, recycling of plastics beginning in 1990s. Yep. Aluminium cans are increasing a lot, absolutely. Yep. Ranjit, you think aluminium cans a key feature as well? Probably because they've changed the most. They've shown the biggest increase. So that would be a good place to start. I mean, if I am thinking about recycling, I'm probably interested in, what is recycled the most in this country, right? What is recycled the most? Possibly what's recycled the least as well. So let's take a look. I have created one example here for you. Overall, the proportion of paper and cardboard, which was the highest of the 4 classes of material. However, this category experienced a decline after 1994, whereas there was a continuous increase in the recycling of all other materials over the same period. So here, the 2 trends I've decided to focus on is the fact that paper and cardboard is the highest, but after about 1994, it decreased while everything else increased. Okay, to me, this is the most interesting information about this graph, is that actually paper has decreased, even though it's still high, while everything else has increased. Okay, so this is one possible interpretation. Rifvadi, you've mentioned plastics have the least as well. And yeah, I agree. That is another key feature, actually. You're interested in the most and the least. So, and I've highlighted that in a second example here, which is overall paper and cardboard recycling rates were the highest over the period, while plastics recycling was the lowest. After 1994, the percentage of paper and cardboard being recycled began to fall. Recycling of all other materials increased. So here, I focused 3 main points. Paper and cardboard being high, plastics low, and the change from all other materials increasing. Yeah, and exactly, Jehan, thank you. You said aluminium suddenly increased as against a steady drop in paper and cardboard. I think that would be a fair main point to mention as well. Yeah. So once you have described your main points, the next step is to describe them in a bit more detail in the next two paragraphs. And you can describe your main points in more detail. You can also give a bit more detail about any other interesting parts of the graph. So to do that, will benefit you to look at some useful language, because you'll be talking about changes and you don't want to repeat yourself by constantly saying decrease, decrease. So here there is some useful language. I'm going to share this with you so that we can go through it together. And I'd like you to think about other ways to say these, to express these ideas. So instead of saying go down, to go down, what's another verb that means go down? Decline. Thank you. Yes. So you can say album or paper and cardboard declined, decreased. What about verb for go up? You've said plummet is also plummet is a good verb to use, but does it suggest a strong or a weak fall? It's actually a very strong drop. So you need to make sure if you say plummet that it's describing a very steep fall rather than a gentle. So good. So we've got decline. And we have an incline or a climb. Any other verbs for go up? We have rise. Increase. Thank you, Ravati. Yep, increase can also mean go up. Excellent. Ellen, you've mentioned descend. Descend does mean down, but you would not use that to describe the chart. I think you would say cardboard percentage descended. It's quite appropriate for the chart. So Galaxy S8 Plus, you've mentioned upgrade. This again it doesn't go up or to improve, but we won't use it when describing a figure like a chart. So no, you won't use upgrade. Rise, Parit. Yeah, that's correct. Raised, increased is fine. Okay. If the chart is both going up and down like this over a period, we can use the word fluctuate. Or if it's the opposite and it's like this, you can say it remains steady or remains stable. Paramjit, you've mentioned blow hot and cold. This is a nice expression, but we won't use it to describe the chart. It's quite informal and it is not quite appropriate. Blowing hot and cold is more to describe someone's mood. If one day I'm happy and friendly and the next day I'm angry and mean, you can say I'm blowing hot and cold, but it sounds unusual to describe a chart like this. Very good. Prerit, constant, remains constant, appropriate. Excellent. Now, what about for the noun, instead of a fall, what would be an appropriate noun for Instead of saying a fall, we say a decrease. Very good. And we might often say experienced. Experienced a decrease. Experienced a fall. So it will go together with the verb there. And what about if we say the noun for go up? We have an increase. It experienced a move up is a verb, so that would be fine for a verb galaxy, but for arise, Ravathi, exactly, arise. So you can say, you know, aluminium cans experienced a rise over the period. If we want to say it goes up or down, up and down, a verb for, instead of a noun rather, for fluctuate. Very good, Rania. Experienced a fluctuation over the time period. Exactly. And if we say a noun for steadiness, it stayed the same, it experienced so we have remained steady, remained stable. A plateau is fine. Yeah, a plateau usually is when it goes up and then remains constant. Stability, very good. Arusak, yep, exactly. It experienced stability would be absolutely fine. Very good. Now, we can also use an adjective here. We can say a steady fall, a steady, or let's say, if it's more dramatic, we could say a sharp fall, a sharp decrease. If we want to say a slight or a steep increase or a steep rise. If the chart is going up and down very dramatically, we could say a wild fluctuation or a dramatic fluctuation. And we can also use the verb and the adverb, such as, you know, increased sharply, increased steadily, rose dramatically. Actually, sorry, this should be here. Increased sharply, decreased steeply. Okay. So I have here the completed example, which I will share to you, share with you on the webinar slides after the webinar. So here you have the full table. So this language can help you to express changes very precisely without repeating yourself. Okay, so if you have any questions about this, please feel free to ask them. We can address them towards the end. Moving on, let's practice putting these to use when we describe the details of the chart. So in my overview, I decided to focus on paper and cardboard as one of my main points. In my next paragraph, I'm going to spend 1 or 2 sentences describing this trend in more detail. So I have here an example with some missing words. Can you suggest the missing words for this sentence? In 1982, about 65% of paper and cardboard was recycled. This figure, Rafati said, decreased before rising to reach a peak. It did drop, but it also rose. So from 92, it went up and it went down. What? Very good, Rania. Fluctuated. Yeah, this figure fluctuated. It went up and it went down before rising. How did it rise? Gradually or steadily? Steadily suggests slowly, Jahan. I think this one is a bit more dramatic. Thank you, Rafati. Rania, rising sharply would be fine here. Rising sharply to reach a peak of 80% in 1994. From then on, however, it to a level of 70% in 2010. So what did it do from 1990 to 2010? It went down. Good. Jahan, excellent. Declined gradually, decreased rapidly. Varsha, I wouldn't say this is a rapid decrease. I would say it's a gradual decrease. It's dropping steadily, slowly, gradually. So here you are, complete example. In 1980, about 65% of paper and cardboard were recycled. This figure fluctuated before rising steeply to reach a peak of 80% in 1994. From then on, however, it decreased steadily to a level of 70% in 2010. So this is a very clear, detailed description of the trend for your final description paragraph. Now, would you like to have a go at describing another trend? Here, the glass container. So feel free to post your suggestion in the comments.
Okay, we have a first attendee saying yes to this question. So please, Ruxias, hoping I'm pronouncing your name correctly, please write your answer down to the comment.
Sure. Challenging description. So I think you're fine to take your time and see if you can describe the trend for glass containers. Hi there, Prajna Pandit. You mentioned you missed the meeting for task 2. I believe, Han, that the task still on. Prajna Pandit, you could go back, yes, watch that webinar. Yeah.
Yes, okay, so we have a recording video for the last meeting, the last webinar on our Facebook page, IELTS online test. So please do go, you can find it on our Facebook page. And we're also going to have another webinars on test 2 writing. So you can stay tuned, looking for it on our website for more information.
Excellent.
Yeah, so we have
Thank you.
answers here. We have 2 answers.
I can see an answer from Rania here. The percentage of recycled glass containers decreased gradually from 50% to 40% over the period between 1982 to 1990. Then it started to increase to reach 60% by 2010. Rania, this is an excellent example. I think it's very accurate and it contains all the important information. I think one change you could possibly make to improve it slightly, if you say then it started or then it gradually increased or steadily increased to reach 60% by 2010, just to express that it happened over a longer period of time. Excellent. And in glass container bottomed out in 1990 with a sharp increase from 1990 to 1994, and then a similar percentile up to 2010. This is good. I would say you perhaps do not want to say then a similar percentile. I think here there was a sharp increase from 1990 to 1994. This is fine. And then a gradual increase or a similar increase up to 2010. This is more accurate. A similar percentile is not quite correct. One more print. The glass container rates went down till 1990, but gradually rises to 60% by 2010. Good prayer, very clear. You could say the glass container rates went down until 1990, but gradually rose in the past tense, gradually rose to 60% by 2010. Very good. I'm going to share with you one example here so that you can see something I've prepared before. So in 1982, half of all glass containers were recycled. This figure dropped to 40% in 1990, but the rate gradually increased from 40% to 60% by 2010. So here described the percentage at the beginning of the period. In 1982, half of all containers were recycled. This figure dropped to 40% in the middle in 1990, but then it gradually increased to 60% by 2010. So the second part. So I think this is a useful structure if you describe at the beginning, the movement to the middle, and then where does the figure finish? Where does the percentage finish? Okay, this will make your description very clear because it has a clear beginning, a middle, and an end. Now I want to make sure that we have some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to move on to show you a completed sample answer here, and then we'll take a look at some questions. So here we have the introduction. The chart illustrates the percentages of paper and cardboard, glass, aluminium cans, and plastic which were recycled in one country between 1982 and 2010. Clear parrot introduction. We then have the overview, introduced overall, the proportion of paper and cardboard which was recycled was highest of the four classes of material. However, this category experienced a decline after 1994, whereas there was a continuous increase in the recycling of all other materials over the same period. So that's my view statement describing two of the main trends. I'm now going to give you a description of the first trend, talking about paper and cardboard. In 1982, about 60% of paper and cardboard was recycled. This figure fluctuated before rising steeply to reach a peak of 80% in 1994. From then on, however, it decreased steadily to a level of 70% in 2010. In 1982, half of all glass containers were recycled. This figure 40% in 1990, but the rate of glass recycling gradually increased from 40% to 60% by 2010. So here I've described two of the key trends in the graph. In my final paragraph, I'll describe remaining information. Firstly, aluminium cans. Aluminium cans were first recycled in 1986, starting at about 5%. But this figure climbed rapidly over 24 years, and by 2010 it had risen 45%. On the other hand, recycling of plastics was not introduced until 1990, and although growth in this category was constant, it was very slow, rising from around 2% to about 8% over the period. So this complete sample answer, it's 194 words, so it's a little bit over the limit, but it's to give you a clear example of describing the key information in the graph. So thank you very much. That's all from my presentation. It's over to you now to ask any questions.
Okay, so we
please
have
feel free to post.
yes, we have one question from Paramjit. Can we write overview in the last?
Yes. Ranjit, that's a good question. I have seen some example answers with an overview as the conclusion. And there is not just one correct structure. There are different structures that can work. I think the structure that I've presented you with today is a very standard one, and it's very clear. And I think that it can help the examiner to see what aspect we're going to focus on. So that might help to make it clearer. It's definitely possible to write the overview at the end, but you run the risk of perhaps confusing the examiner slightly if you go straight into this specific detail. It might make your structure not so obvious. So if you feel confident writing an overview, that's fine. It's not automatic, but I find a lot of students are more simple to follow and easier to write a clear answer. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Paramjit, I hope this helps. And then we have another question. Sir, can you give ideas for other types of chart?
For sure. There are different types of charts, static charts, which are typically bar charts or pie charts. There's as well, which can actually be both types. I think the scope of this webinar is for the dynamic chart. So a detailed description, other types will need to wait for another day, I'm afraid, but that could certainly be the topic of a future presentation. We could look at the static charts in another webinar soon.
Thank you, Jamie. And then we have another question. Can we write an introduction precisely by just mentioning key points?
Sorry, could you read the question for me? I got that, but yeah.
Yeah. From Prerit Khan. Can we write an introduction precisely by just mentioning key points?
Um, I think the introduction should uh, state the topic of the graph, the chart. So you shouldn't really mention introduction because that will be too much detail. You first need to tell the examiner what is the subject of the graph, what is the topic, and the easiest way to do that is by placing the title of the graph. I would start mentioning key points until your overview. Okay, so thank you for that.
Yes. And from Galaxy SH Plus, can we explain this all into paragraphs or 4 paragraphs is compulsory?
That's a good question. Thank you. Let me go back so I can show you my structure here. As that is a very good question. Four paragraphs is not great. This is a suggestion to help it to you clearly structure it. My suggestion would be to write a separate paragraph for your introductory statement, your review, and then either 1 or 2 paragraphs for your description. But you could also choose to write 1 paragraph with your introduction and overview together, and then 1 or 2 paragraphs for your description. Um, it's not essential to have 4, but I would 2, 3, or 4 paragraphs would be suitable. The one thing I would avoid doing is writing one very long paragraph with no paragraphing, because that can make your ideas more difficult to follow. So definitely use whether it's 2, 3, or 4 paragraphs. As long as your ideas are clearly structured with those paragraphs, you should be fine.
Yeah, and we have some more questions just in the chat section. Is it necessary to paraphrase all the words in introduction?
Again, that's a very good question. And it is not essential to paraphrase every word at all. And in fact, you shouldn't attempt to paraphrase every word, because some of the words, they do not have an easy way to paraphrase them. So don't try to paraphrase every, but try to paraphrase 1 or 2 words, either using synonyms or using slightly different grammar, just so that you're not rewriting in exactly the same words. Okay, but no, it's if you're not 100% confident in your word choice, I wouldn't paraphrase, because it's better to repeat yourself rather than using an inaccurate or confusing expression. So I would focus on accuracy here rather than showing a breadth of language.
Okay, so we will have the final question. Is it mandatory to write the conclusion?
Yeah, you can see a question again. It's a good question. You do not need to write a conclusion, so it's not mandatory. You can see in my sample answer, this is a very strong sample answer, and there is no conclusion. The summary of the main points is presented in the overview in paragraph 2. So there is no need to repeat yourself writing a similar summary, as you've already done that. For some other types of task, it might be useful to write the conclusion, short concluding sentence. This is typically only for describing a process. Because when you're describing a process, you have a beginning and an end point, and you want to summarize or to show that that is the final point in the process. But when you're describing graph, there's no end point, so there's no need to write that conclusion. Okay, thank you.
So we are very near to closing of this webinar. And we are receiving more questions, so maybe we will add, you can go to the recording on our Facebook page, and then we will try to answer this one later. We're going to have another webinar next week. We will put on a banner for this on our website at IELTSonlinetest.com. Please go there to keep up with the information. And if you have any other question or any concern about the IELTS test, please, you can send us an email at hi@IELTSonlinetest.com or send us a message on our Facebook page, IELTS Online Test. We also offer a writing evaluation service and speaking online tests. So if you're interested in that, you can find more information on our website. Yes. Maybe we'll answer one more question before we end. Some teachers, and according to some samples, we should not be write year and the data in overview. Is this right?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Yes, you give too much specific information in the overview. So you don't want to start going into exact percentages, exact figures. It might be helpful to mention a date or maybe, a peak, like 1 or 2 figures, dates might be okay to illustrate the main point, but you're not using it to describe the trend in detail. You're just highlighting the key information. So as a rule of thumb, do not use the figures in the overview. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jamie. Okay, the time is up now. We have some other question here, so maybe we'll answer you on our via our email, and we're looking forward to seeing all of you again in our next webinar next week. Thank you, Jamie, for joining us, and thank you to all of you to joining this webinar.
Thank you very much, Han. Thank everyone. See you again. Bye for now.
Yeah, and the recording will be uploaded to our website, to our fans page on Facebook. So if you miss this one, you can go there and watch it all again. Thank you. Thank you again.